Jonathan and Rebecca Carter thought they had found salvation when they gave everything to Pastor Elias Marlowe and his religious group, the Saints of Purity. But what began as a promise of eternal life ended in the secret burial of their 7-year-old daughter Abigail, hidden beneath the trees of a compound where faith was twisted into control. Their story would unravel a web of silence, unmarked graves, and blind obedience that shocked an entire town and left the world asking, how could parents choose loyalty to a cult over the life of their child? Silverbrook was the kind of place where nothing ever seemed to happen. Tucked away behind rolling hills and framed by dense forests, it had the kind of quiet charm that made it appear timeless, untouched by the chaos of the outside world. But in the late 1990s, something began to change. Families were drawn there by whispers of a group that promised salvation and peace. A group that claimed to know the truth about life and eternity. They called themselves the Saints of Purity, and at the center of it all was Pastor Elias Marlowe. Marlowe was unlike anyone the townspeople had ever seen. Tall, with a calm but commanding presence, he had the ability to make every word sound like it was carved in stone. His eyes, a striking shade of blue, seemed to look straight through people, as if he could see their sins and their secrets. When he preached, he spoke about purity, about the dangers of modern life, and about the evils of medicine, science, and institutions that weakened the soul. He promised healing through prayer, protection through faith, and eternal life to those willing to give everything they had to the cause. At first, his message drew only a handful of families who were struggling, lost, or searching for meaning. But soon, the Saints of Purity grew larger, gaining property on the edge of town where they built a compound. Rows of modest houses, a central chapel, and community gardens began to appear. The members gave up their possessions, their savings, and in some cases, even their family ties outside the group. They were told that sacrifice was the path to purity, and that their leader was chosen to guide them into a new era of righteousness. Among those who joined early were Jonathan and Rebecca Carter. Jonathan was a man who had always sought certainty, and in Marlowe he found someone who spoke with absolute authority. Rebecca was quieter, more hesitant. But when Jonathan insisted that joining the Saints would protect their family, she followed. With them came their 2 children, Samuel, their serious and obedient son, and Abigail, a bright and spirited little girl who quickly became loved within the community. Life inside the compound was strict but orderly. Members rose before dawn for prayer, worked long hours in the gardens or kitchens, and gathered each evening to listen to Marlowe's teachings. Outsiders were distrusted, modern conveniences were shunned, and medical care was forbidden. If someone fell ill, the community gathered in prayer circles, believing that any true believer would be healed by faith alone. If they were not, Marlowe would explain that their suffering was a test from God, or punishment for hidden sin. Over time, what seemed like a peaceful religious group to outsiders was revealed within its walls to be something far more controlling. Families could not make decisions without Marlowe's approval. Members were encouraged to report one another for disobedience. Even children were taught to fear leaving, as they were told that stepping outside the compound's fences meant abandoning God. Those who questioned the rules were shamed publicly, sometimes punished with fasting or isolation. Still, many members, including the Carters, clung to the belief that they were chosen, special, and safe. For Jonathan, following Marlowe's every command gave him a sense of purpose he had never felt before. For Rebecca, doubt lingered in quiet moments, but speaking against Marlowe felt unthinkable. They had given up everything to be there. To admit that they had been wrong meant tearing apart the fragile world they had built, and so the Saints of Purity grew stronger, hidden behind their fences, their secrets safe for the time being. By the spring of 2005, The saints of purity had settled into their routines so deeply that most members no longer remembered what life had been like before. Every day was marked by prayer, labor, and obedience, all under the watchful eye of Pastor Elias Marlowe. But within the Carter family, a storm was quietly beginning. Their youngest child, Abigail, only 7 years old, had always been full of energy. She was known for running barefoot across the gardens, her laughter echoing between the houses, her hair wild in the wind. That spring, though, her laughter faded. She grew tired, her steps heavy, her eyes dim with fever. At first, it seemed like nothing serious. Children caught colds and shook them off quickly, or at least that was what the members told themselves. Marlowe reminded the group that faith, not medicine, was the cure for all ailments. Doctors, he said, were instruments of corruption, leading believers away from God. Jonathan Carter clung to those words. He repeated them to Rebecca each time she expressed worry, telling her that this was a test, that Abigail would recover if they simply prayed hard enough. The fever did not pass. Abigail's small body grew hot to the touch, and her once bright eyes became glassy and unfocused. Rebecca sat beside her, wiping her forehead with damp cloths, whispering to her, humming old lullabies she had nearly forgotten. But the cloths did little, the songs less. In the morning, Jonathan called the other saints to gather, and together they laid their hands on Abigail, surrounding her in prayer circles that lasted for hours. They chanted, they sang, they begged for divine healing. Yet when the sun went down, the child was weaker than she had been that morning. Days blurred into weeks. Rebecca pleaded in whispers to Jonathan, asking to take Abigail to a hospital outside the compound. She knew doctors could help her daughter. She knew she was losing her. But Jonathan's face hardened every time, his devotion unshaken. He reminded her that leaving would condemn them all, that Abigail's soul was at stake, that turning to outsiders was betrayal. His words left Rebecca trembling, torn between faith and instinct, between loyalty to her husband and love for her child. Other families in the compound joined in the prayers, some sincerely convinced, others quietly haunted by memories of their own children who had once fallen sick and never risen again. But in the saints of purity, silence was survival. No one dared challenge Marlowe's rules openly. They spoke of miracles that would surely come, even as Abigail's small frame grew fragile, her ribs sharp beneath her skin, her voice too weak to call out for her mother. The morning she stopped breathing, the community responded with eerie calm. Marlowe declared it the will of God, a sign of purity, a passage into eternal life. Abigail's body was wrapped quickly, and within hours she was buried in the woods beyond the compound fence, hidden beneath the trees. There were no records, no gravestone, no acknowledgement to the outside world that she had ever lived or died. The saints carried on their prayers as if nothing had changed. But Rebecca knew everything had changed. Something inside her broke that day, though she could not yet bring herself to admit it. The child's death, meant to be buried in silence, would soon become the spark that exposed the saints' darkest truths. For months after Abigail Carter's burial, the compound in Silverbrook remained quiet, its fences holding in both the faithful and their secrets. The saints of purity carried on their routines with an unsettling normalcy. New prayers were added to daily rituals, but they were spoken not in mourning, rather in celebration of Abigail's ascension. Pastor Elias Marlowe told the congregation that the child's death was proof of God's testing, that the community had been chosen to suffer for a greater purpose. Jonathan Carter repeated those words to himself until they hardened like stone in his mind. But Rebecca carried the weight differently. She still heard Abigail's faint cries in the night, still saw her small hands reaching for help that never came. She tried to bury her grief the way the saints had buried her daughter quietly and quickly, but it lingered, gnawing at her spirit. Life outside the compound, however, was not blind to the whispers. Silverbrook was small, and when the Carters stopped appearing in town altogether, questions arose. Local shopkeepers noticed their absence, and extended family members who were still outside the Saints began to grow suspicious. One of them reached out to Lydia Hawthorne, a former member who had fled the group years earlier. Lydia had once lived within the compound walls, had once prayed the same prayers, but she had escaped when her own child became sick, and she could no longer obey Marlowe's command to avoid doctors. She had left everything behind, and though she built a new life, the past haunted her. When she received the message about Abigail's death, a familiar chill returned. She had long suspected that children were at risk inside those fences, but now she was certain. Lydia contacted authorities, insisting that something terrible was happening in Silverbrook. At first, the police treated her claims cautiously. Without evidence, her words sounded like the grievances of a disgruntled ex-member. But Lydia's persistence forced attention. Soon, quiet investigations began. Officers drove past the compound at odd hours, watching the patterns of life within. They saw children, but rarely heard laughter. They saw gardens and prayer circles, but also a strictness in movement, a rigid control that felt unnatural. What they did not see were doctor visits, school trips, or any sign of normal childhood outside the gates. With each passing month, more troubling stories emerged. Former members who had left over the years began to speak anonymously, describing how illnesses were treated only with prayer and how questioning Marlowe's teachings was forbidden. One spoke of a child who had died years earlier from pneumonia, another of an infant who never received medical care after birth. Though there were no official records, the accounts added up, forming a chilling pattern of silence and hidden loss. Finally, armed with testimony and mounting suspicion, authorities secured a search warrant. When they stepped onto the compound grounds, the illusion of purity began to crumble. Behind the chapel, and deep in the wooded edges of the land, small mounds of disturbed earth were discovered. Shovels and soil samples confirmed the worst fears. Unmarked graves, each holding the remains of children who had died under mysterious circumstances. Abigail Carter was only one among them. The news rippled through Silverbrook like a shockwave. For years, the Saints had seemed untouchable, living behind their fences in an isolated world. Now, the truth was undeniable. The death of one child had opened a door to a hidden history of suffering. Investigators realized they were not simply looking at a religious community, but at something darker, a system of control, fear, and blind obedience that had allowed tragedy after tragedy to unfold in silence. The Saints of Purity were no longer a mystery hidden in the hills. They were now the focus of a criminal investigation that would shake their foundations to the core. The trial of the Saints of Purity in 2007 was unlike anything the town of Silverbrook had ever witnessed. What had once been dismissed as nothing more than a fringe religious group now stood exposed under the harsh lights of a courtroom. The benches were packed with reporters, former members, and townspeople who had long wondered what was happening behind the tall fences of the compound. Pastor Elias Marlowe, the man who had built the group from a handful of followers into a tightly controlled community, sat at the defense table in a dark suit, his face calm, almost serene. To his right sat Jonathan Carter and two senior members of the Saints, each accused of manslaughter and child neglect. Their expressions shifted between shame and defiance, as if torn between their loyalty to Marlowe and the crushing reality of what they faced. The prosecution began by laying out the timeline of Abigail Carter's death. They spoke of the fever that had gone untreated, the refusal to seek medical help, and the burial that had been carried out in secret. Photographs of the unmarked graves found in the woods were displayed before the jury, each image casting a heavy silence over the room. For many watching, it was the first time they fully grasped the scale of the tragedy. It was no longer about one child. It was about a pattern, a system designed to silence suffering and hide loss. In the name of faith, witnesses were called, one after another, to testify. Former members described life inside the compound, how every choice was dictated by Marlowe, how dissent was punished with isolation or humiliation, and how children were treated as offerings of purity rather than individuals with rights. Lydia Hawthorne's testimony struck the hardest. She recounted her years in the group, her decision to leave when her own child became sick, and the guilt she carried for not speaking out sooner. Her voice trembled as she described the fear that kept parents silent, the manipulation that convinced them disobedience meant damnation. The jury listened intently, their expressions grim, their pens scribbling notes. The defense, led by a sharp and theatrical attorney, tried to reframe the narrative. They argued that this was not a case of criminal neglect, but an issue of religious freedom. The saints of purity, they claimed, were practicing their faith as guaranteed by the Constitution. To punish them, the defense insisted, was to punish belief itself. But each time the argument was raised, the prosecution returned to the same point. Children had died. Faith was not on trial, but the choices made by those in power were. When Jonathan Carter finally took the stand, his composure cracked. He admitted he had ignored his wife's pleas to take Abigail to a hospital. He admitted he had chosen loyalty to Marlowe over his daughter's life. The weight of those words hung in the courtroom like a stone. Rebecca Carter sat in the gallery, her face pale, her eyes fixed on the floor. She had refused to testify against her husband, but her silence spoke as loudly as any words. As the trial neared its end, the atmosphere grew heavier. The jury had listened to weeks of testimony, seen evidence of graves, and heard the voices of parents who had lost children to a doctrine that demanded blind obedience. When the verdict was read, the silence was absolute. Elias Marlowe was found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. Jonathan Carter and the senior members each received long sentences for their roles. The saints of purity, once untouchable, were dismantled in that moment, their power broken under the weight of the law. The courtroom emptied slowly, people whispering, reporters rushing to file stories, families crying quietly in the back. What had begun as whispers in a small town had ended in a reckoning that no one could ignore. The trial had not only exposed the crimes of the saints, but also forced the world to question how far faith could go before it crossed into abuse. When the verdict was delivered and the saints of purity were dismantled, Silverbrook was left with a wound that would not easily heal. The compound, once alive with chanting and tightly ordered routines, fell silent. Its wooden fences began to sag, its gardens wilted without the constant labor of devoted hands, and the chapel at its center stood like a hollow monument to promises that had ended in death. For many in the town, the group had always seemed distant, a curiosity that existed on the edges of their lives. Now, the truth of what had happened there became a shadow stretching over everyone, a reminder that such darkness had thrived in plain sight. The aftermath was complicated. Some former members of the saints attempted to rebuild their lives in the outside world. Children who had grown up knowing nothing beyond the compound struggled to adapt to schools, technology, and friendships beyond their fences. Some flourished, discovering new opportunities they had never imagined, while others drifted in confusion, longing for the structure they had once resented. A few still clung to Marlowe's teachings, visiting him in prison, calling him a martyr, convinced that the state had crushed a holy man rather than a criminal. For Rebecca Carter, the world outside the saints was one of silence and grief. Though Jonathan sat behind bars, his influence over her life had not entirely vanished. She lived with the memory of Abigail's final days, replaying them in endless loops, wondering if there had ever been a moment when she could have broken free, when she could have chosen differently. To neighbors, she appeared ghost-like, moving quietly through her days, speaking little. To herself, she carried the unbearable weight of knowing she had been present when her daughter begged with her eyes for help she never gave. Some called her a victim, others an accomplice. She never corrected either. The story of the Saints of Purity began to spread beyond Silverbrook. Documentaries, books, and investigative podcasts retold the case, each drawing larger audiences who were horrified to learn that children had been allowed to die in a modern society under the guise of faith. Legal scholars debated the boundaries of religious freedom, asking whether the law had been too slow to intervene. Lawmakers proposed stricter protections for children in religious communities, determined to ensure that what had happened in Silverbrook would not be repeated elsewhere. Yet, despite the exposure, a strange kind of myth grew around the group. Some former members spoke publicly about their experiences, describing a community that had promised belonging but delivered control. Others refused to talk, still bound by fear or by twisted loyalty to the man who had led them. The compound itself, abandoned and decaying, became a destination for those fascinated by the macabre, with urban explorers sneaking onto the grounds to photograph peeling paint, empty rooms, and the chapel where Marlowe once preached about purity. For the families who lost children, though, there was no fascination, only scars. Each grave uncovered in the woods was a reminder of lives cut short, of laughter that had been replaced by silence, of innocence smothered under the weight of doctrine. Abigail Carter's name became the most recognized, her story the spark that had revealed the full horror of the saints. But behind her were other children, unnamed and long forgotten, whose voices had been silenced before the world ever knew they existed. The legacy of the Saints of Purity is not measured in the number of convictions or in the collapse of a compound. It is measured in the haunting reminder that blind obedience can turn belief into a weapon, that communities can be built not on faith, but on fear, and that silence in the face of suffering allows tragedy to grow unchecked. In Silverbrook, the fences still stand, weathered and splintering, but they no longer hold in believers. They stand instead as a warning, a quiet testament to the price that was paid when trust was given to the wrong hands.